What is your downright scariest real-life story? Story 1. I used to sleepwalk when I was a child. We lived in a rough neighborhood, Decatur, GA, and I would wake up outside in the middle of the night, not knowing how I got there, and would have to walk home and walk into the darkened doorway I had left wide open for whoever might be lurking around. However, the time that scared me the most was when I was about 9 years old. I woke up and found myself with the bedroom curtains drawn back and staring out the window. As I first came awake, I noticed a very large and completely hairless man, no hair, eyebrows, etc., staring at me and slowly inching closer to the window and closer to my face. He was looking bewildered, like he wasn't sure what he was seeing. At that moment, I realized what was going on, and I started screaming uncontrollably, frozen in place and peeing down my leg. The man freaked out and screamed, did a tumbling move, and then ran off in a weird zigzag, like he was trying to dodge bullets. My mum woke up and thought I probably had a nightmare. The next morning, we found a screwdriver on the front porch and damage to the door jamb and door handle. I still just about pee my pants when I tell that story, but now it is usually from laughing. I will never forget the look on his face when I started coming to life and screaming, or his high-pitched scream, or his duck and roll and dodging and bobbing all the way down the street. Story 2. I was active duty in the Navy, served aboard a submarine. We were in port one day. Most of the crew had left. The guys on duty for the night, that's us, were given permission to bring our kids on board for dinner. Halfway through the meal, someone makes a 4 megacalams announcement. 4MC is the emergency announcement intercom thing. Says there's light smoke in the engine room, quickly followed by fire in the engine room. We train for this stuff religiously, so everyone is immediately in action. Commanding officer is still there but topside. One of our senior enlisted guys apparently ran the kids up front to a hatch where he was, quite literally, throwing them through the hatch as our co caught them and set them on the deck topside. The rest of us ran toward the fire, and I see no one grabbing a mask. Not one person. So I grabbed a big handful of breathing masks and followed through the hatch where we're greeted by what appeared to be a light smoke filling the entire engine room. But it didn't smell like smoke. It was sweet. Tasted sweet. An oil pump had blown and filled the entire back half of the boat with atomized hydraulic fluid. A guy was moments from lighting a torch in the engine room as the casualty was called. Had it been called just a moment later, we'd have walked into an inferno. Had he, for some reason, not heard it called and lit the torch when after we had run in, we'd have been on fire before we could react. Turned out perfectly fine. Cleaned the oil that clung to all the surfaces and fixed the pump. But it was somewhat surreal, understanding just how close we were to a wildly different result. Story 3. I was home alone when I was 11. I had just fallen asleep and someone tried to break in the front door. I called 911 and hid in the pantry in the bottom shelf. They came to the door next to the pantry and tried to break into that door too. The police got there, and one of them picked me up and held me until my mum got there. I wouldn't let go, and he made sure I felt safe. I'm 27 and haven't stayed home alone much since. The day I signed a lease for my first apartment, I got a dog so I wouldn't be alone. It's pretty traumatizing when you're that young. Story 4. I always parked in a certain spot at my last job for 12 years that I was there. It was accessible to the public as it wasn't company parking, but they wanted us to park in the back of the lot, so the closest spots could be available for customers. One day my spot's taken by a dark-tinted caddy, and I'm immediately pissed because everyone knows it's mine. It's morning shift, so 4 a.m, so it can't be one of the others because I know what they drive. So newbie, or maybe another employee from another shop in the plaza. It's still there on my lunch break, and when I go home and the next day I come in at 1 p.m. till close, around 9:30. and then also the next. Something about it really bothered me. It smelled wrong. Literally, it's the South and high summer, and who knows what's baking in there. My dad was a Marine then, a police officer. He always said if you feel something is wrong, there probably is. So I dialed the non-emergency contact police number. I felt like an idiot, but every time I walked by it bugged me. So I was stuck waiting for over an hour before anyone shows, and honestly, if I hadn't been off the next day, it would have been like F it. But I waited, mostly because I can be really a petty SOB, and that's my spot, damn it. The police show, all annoyed because who knows how many they can't park here. Calls they get. They run the license plate though, and then things go crazy. They want my info, want me to contact my manager. Does this lot have cameras? Have I touched the car? Etc. Apparently the car is on Amber Alert as the last sighting of a missing person who was a minor. A 15-year-old girl. When they pop the trunk, they find her dead, mutilated body under a blanket and the source of the smell. She had gone out with her much older, controlling and insecure boyfriend, but had decided to get out of the relationship. She only made the mistake of getting into the car with him. He drove 3 counties over after torturing her, stuffing her in there and who knows what else, then parked and walked away, left her to die in the trunk. I never learned her time of death, so it haunts me sometimes thinking she might have been saved if I'd made a fuss earlier. So yeah, listen to your gut, even if it seems petty. Story 5. Was with a guy for a couple of years when I realized that he'd taken up smoking meth as a hobby after work. We had numerous problems already, and I had 3 small kids, so I finally kicked him out. A few days later, maybe a week, he makes a fake Facebook page and sends me a friend request. The only posts on the page were talking about killing me and my children, his suicide, and how he planned to do it that day. The most recent post was accompanied by a selfie of him in my backyard. A recent selfie, so he had been there. I was on my way home with the kids late in the evening when I got the request. I had stopped by my parents' home the day before and gotten my dad's 9mm handgun because he was sending messages through mutual friends about burning my house down. I called the police as soon as I got home, and they didn't seem to think it was a big deal and didn't have an officer available to come check my house before we walked into it. I live in the middle of the woods, and we have a rinky-dink police force. Anyway, I made the kids stay in the car. I gave my oldest instructions on what to do if anything happened, and I had to sweep my own home, in the dark, with a 9mm in case he was in there waiting for me and my children, and it was terrifying. I had to check my entire house every time we came home for a while, and I was always worried that I'd eventually find him in there. Police were called numerous times, and I was eventually granted a restraining order. A couple weeks later, when the death threats continued, he died about a year ago, and all I felt was relief. Story 6. Hearing a weird groan while hanging out with friends in a sketchy part of Phoenix. We could hear someone groaning and occasionally saying, "Help," in a soft and tired voice. We go towards the voice and find a guy laying on the ground in a blood-covered shirt, one hand holding up a knife in his gut. His eyes were weirdly focused on us, but was whimpering and writhing. He kept saying, "Help me. Oh God, I'm going to die. Please, help me." We said we would call an ambulance, and he really didn't like that idea. "No, don't call 911, just help me. I'm going to die." We called anyway. He stood up in his blood-covered shirt, knife in hand, said "fuck," and ran away. Story 7. I have cerebral palsy, but I have always worked while at and after leaving college, sometimes having 2 or 3 jobs at a time. When this incident happened, I was 22, renting my bungalow and living alone. I was going to work. My main job at the time was as a dance, fitness, and play therapy assistant to a group of therapists working for young people with physical, learning disabilities, and extreme behavior disorders. As I'm a full-time wheelchair user, I had to use a cab to travel to and from work. And although most of the guys driving for the cab firm were solid and really nice, there were a few dodgy ones, as in most walks of life. I could transfer quite easily, so all the drivers had to do was hold my wheelchair steady, then fold it up, and then put it in the boot. On this day, the guy turned up at 8:30 a.m. late. I proceeded to transfer. I felt him right up close behind me. His hand brushed lightly over my back and bottom. It's worth mentioning that I had slight issues with this man before, mostly making smutty remarks and asking me out for a drink. I said no. He got slightly nasty, and I ended up having to report it to the firm. As I'm disabled, there wasn't much I could do, as I was holding myself up and I couldn't let go of the door. I swore at him, managing to swing around to sit in the car, and told him never to do that. He just laughed and smirked. We started to drive. 10 minutes in, I noticed we weren't going the regular route to get to the center where I worked. Being angry, and also the fact that I was already late for work, I asked him about this. He ignored my questions and said in a cold voice, "You know I live around here. I could take you to my flat where my 3 mates are, and there wouldn't be anything you could do about it." When he said this, I was crapping myself inside, but I said in my bravest voice, "If I'm much later, work will call me, and they have your firm's details too." With that, he scowled at me big time. And after a while, I soon recognized the usual route to work. When I arrived at work, my boss was worried. He saw the driver, who we didn't have time for either, asked me if I was okay. After a while, I was able to tell my supervisor what had happened, and she first called the cab firm, and then the police, who came to interview me at work and then talk to the man. I don't know what happened to him, but I never saw him again. Story 8. Late 80s to early 90s in Northern Ireland. I was a kid of around 7 or 8. The sun was shining, and it was some time in the early afternoon. My dad needed to return a library book in the Crumlin Road, a Protestant loyalist area in Belfast. We were Catholics, and the Crumlin Road was notoriously dangerous at the time, still is to a lesser extent. So I was already a little on edge, just knowing the reputation of the place. My dad was cool though, didn't seem worried or anything. It's not like we have Catholic printed on our foreheads. He did say, however, that I had to pretend to have a different name if anyone asked me. My name is one which marks you as a Catholic, so I adopted a Protestant name for the trip. We came to a road which led to an intersection, across which was a predominantly Catholic Republican enclave called the Ardoyne Road. We were headed to the right down a long winding path, but further up the road ahead, towards the intersection, we could see a group of men. One of them was running back and forth across the road, relaying information between 2 pockets of people. Some were staring across the road towards the Catholic area. Some were talking to a man in a park butt running car. One in particular stuck out. He had long hair and a leather jacket and was very tall, at least compared to the other men. It all looked suspicious even to me as a child, although I didn't know why. But my dad's demeanor changed to a more serious and quiet one, and I took it as confirmation that we weren't safe. He was from Belfast. We were living in a town outside of Belfast at the time, and grew up when things were at their worst here. So he knew the ropes and knew the signs that something was happening. We weren't walking towards the men, so it wasn't a problem. We crossed to the right and started walking away. This is when a woman approached us. She was middle-aged with short red hair. She saw us coming and made a purposeful beeline towards us. She seemed preoccupied, nervous. She started grilling my dad immediately, asking who he was and where he was coming from. She was talking in a "I'm trying my best to sound casual but I'm failing" manner. I could feel my entire body beginning to boil with fear, and I felt as though I was mere moments away from being discovered. It was like a horror movie, where someone finds themselves in a small town where everyone is in a cult or something. and they're trying to blend in but are drawing suspicion and are losing themselves in an ever-increasing paranoia. I suddenly had visions of my dad getting shot and me screaming over his corpse. Maybe even getting shot myself, despite being a child. The longer my dad and the woman talked, the more I was starting to lose the ability to hear, as though my head was underwater. I was holding my dad's hand, and I was struggling to keep a grip because of the sweat pumping out of my palm. I didn't know how or why, but something primal in me recognized that we were in serious danger. It was clear that she was a part of whatever was going on around the corner, and was trying to manage and analyze the flow of foot traffic, especially that of strangers like us. Given that she and us were the only people on the street, she had been doing a good job. She was fishing hard for information about us. My dad played it cool and responded to her questions without really revealing much, doing a much better job of being casual than she was. The area we were from, he explained, was mixed, i.e. Protestant and Catholic, and he feigned displeasure at that fact, trying to signal that he hated Catholics and was somewhat miffed to have to live amongst them without ever actually using those words. It was subtle, and I was terrified that I might need to participate in the conversation, because there's no way I could dance around the truth as well as my dad was doing. He explained that he was just here to return a book, which he showed her as proof. She asked about me, my name, and I gave her the fake name. She surely read the terror in my face and could hear it in my voice. My dad decided that that was the time to break off and say nice to meet you, all the best, and started walking away with me. I could sense that the woman didn't budge and just stood and stared at us as we walked away. I glanced over my shoulder after about 30 seconds and just caught a glimpse of her turning and walking towards the road where the men were gathered. We rounded a corner and were now at the top of a very long and steep road path with the library at the very bottom of it. The path was fenced on one side, and on the other side was a row of houses. It felt like we were walking deeper into danger and that we had only two routes of escape: keep going or turn back the way we came. About partway down the road, we realized we were being followed. My dad told me to run ahead and check that the library was opened, and I hesitated. He said it was okay and to just go and check. I glanced over my shoulder. It was the man in the leather jacket with the long hair. I did what my dad wanted and ran ahead, heart pounding and ears pricked, awaiting the crack of gunfire. I checked the door was opened, and I ran back up. As I was coming back, I saw that the man in the leather jacket had turned and was making his way back up the road. My dad looked unfazed, but was walking with a certain rigidity, like something had happened in the time it took me to run to the library and back again, and he hadn't quite unclenched his fists yet. He said it was okay and we were safe. I asked about the man following us. He said he sent me ahead, and when I was a safe distance away, he stopped and turned around to face him, ready for whatever happened. He said he was expecting violence, but as he turned around, the leather jacket dude immediately put his head down, turned, and walked back the way he came. My dad watched him for a few seconds, and then started making his way back towards me, ... That afternoon, within the hour we were there, a Catholic taxi driver was murdered in that street. The vibes that something terrible was going to happen were justified, and I've never felt as terrified as I did that day. When the news about the taxi driver was on TV that night, I knew I had seen the planning of a murder, and I knew we had walked into the middle of it. I could probably have identified both the woman and the leather jacket man had I been asked about them by the police. But that was never going to happen. No way my dad would have volunteered himself, and therefore me, to the cops to be a witness against a terrorist cell. Story 9. I can't remember how old I was, but was definitely not older than 10 or younger than 8. But now I'm still traumatized from it. As a black man growing up in the mid-50s through the 60s, Dad suffered a lot of abuse, both at home and outside of it. He even ended up joining the Vietnam War at the very end, fresh out of high school. Because of this, he developed a heavy drinking and drug problem that I wasn't fully aware of as a child. As you can probably guess, this led him to being abusive himself, mostly towards my mum. I don't remember a lot of my childhood, because I blacked a lot of it out. But there's only a couple of nights I'll never forget. A little more backstory: I was, and am, the youngest sibling, and was named after him, before changing it myself, so I didn't really endure a lot of the physical abuse myself, and for the most part, I was always quiet and just tried to stay out of trouble. On to the story though. It was a normal Saturday night. My siblings and I were watching TV. My dad was with his brother somewhere drinking, and surprisingly my mum was at a neighbor's. Single, older woman, just enjoying herself. A couple of weeks before this, my dad ended up getting hurt at work and was on some pretty strong pain pills. So I'm guessing that the large amount of alcohol and possibly heavy drug use lead to what happened next. The next moments are a little fuzzy, but from what I remember, my parents both ended up home and began arguing very loudly with my dad, accusing my mum of cheating on him. I remember we had this big glass table in our living room, and he was so pissed off he slammed his fists on it and shattered it. After that, it all turned physical as he began attacking my mum. She did fight back though, while myself and my brother just stood there crying out, eyes out, begging them to stop. At some point, my sister was about 13, jumped on him, and he tossed her into a door, actually breaking it like it was nothing. During all of this, my dad's brother, who was in his 60s or 70s, was trying to talk him down, but it was like nothing was getting to him. Eventually my dad walked out the door, and my mum sat us all on the couch and just held us while we cried, thinking it was finally over. Until my dad came back in and started pouring some liquid over all of us. It was literally gasoline, and we didn't even realize it until he poured a line outside the door and started trying to light it with a lighter that I'm still thankful wasn't working. My sister ran out the back door to another of my dad's siblings that lived a couple of blocks away. My uncle was able to stop him from trying to burn us all alive. And when he came back in, I just remember grabbing him by the waist, begging him to stop, and saying I had gas in my eyes. I think at that point it broke him out of whatever came over him, because he just began apologizing and checking to see if I was hurt, then he ran off. The thing is though, the worst part isn't that my mom didn't press charges, or that he was only in jail over Kite weekend. It's the fact he doesn't remember any of it, while I think about it almost every day. I do still have a relationship with my dad though, albeit strained. He is completely sober now, and an amazing grandparent to my siblings' kids who he sees every day. Although he's part of the reason I don't think I could ever have kids. I'm not really good at storytelling, so I'm sorry if it gets a little hard to read. I can further explain anything though. Story 10. I was born and raised in the southern US, but decided to move to Minnesota back in the early 2000s. I moved up there with the original intent of going to the University of Minnesota, as they supposedly had a good atmospheric science program, and I knew people that lived in the state, and no one in Oklahoma, or I'd have gone there. Ended up not going to college and just lived with friends. I started dating a Canadian girl, and my home was a 4-hour drive from the border up the Minnesota Arrowhead. It was just after Christmas that year, and I was heading back after spending time with my then girlfriend. It was around dusk when I left. Her house was an hour from the border. Crossed back with no problem. Started driving down Highway 61 like I've done dozens of times before. For those not familiar, this highway runs right along Lake Superior and is only traveled that late by those that live there in the few double-digit populated towns and truckers going from Duluth, Superior to Thunder Bay. The weather was clear, the roads were clear, so I sailed at 60 mph like usual. Well, the road was clear until I hit a patch of black ice. I completely lost control and sailed off the highway. I didn't know if I'd go into the woods on one side or partially frozen Lake Superior on the other. Luckily, I went toward the woods, barrel rolled a few times, and landed on my wheels. I was in a shallow ravine, so my car was hard to see unless you were looking for it. I think it was single-digit temperatures outside. This was before the ubiquity of cell phones. There was zero signal where I crashed, so I was alone, freezing, and on a desolate highway near a patch of black ice that could make someone else sail right into me. I'm not sure how long I was out there, but eventually a local found me and took me to the hospital. I somehow escaped with a few cuts and bruises from the crash, and other than that, and being very cold, I was okay. The state police officer that was at the crash scene when we got back to my car said by all accounts I should have died. If not directly from the crash, then from becoming a meat popsicle. I had no way of contacting my friends or my girlfriend, and I was at least a 4-hour drive from home. The local that found me offered a place to stay until someone could come get me. I was there for 3 days until a friend in Duluth was able to come get me. His name was John, and I'll never, ever forget him. He died in 2018 at 70 years old. I had long since moved back to the south, but kept in touch with him by email. After I crashed, I was in a place I didn't really know, at night, on a road that's not traveled much that late. In winter, freezing. Every moment that passed without a car or semi-passing by, I thought I would freeze to death. I was absolutely terrified. But then John came along and literally saved my life, and for that I'll be eternally thankful. That is all for today. If you have enjoyed this video, do you like and subscribe? I post once a week or more. You can also subscribe to my Patreon below to support me. Hope you have an absolutely amazing day, and hope you will check my other videos on screen.